8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Hello, and welcome to Preaching the Globe, brought to you by the Globe Church. The Preaching the Globe platform is designed to give voice to ministers and ministries across the world. We're so thankful that you decided to join us today and hope that you will be richly blessed.
Please put your hands together as we welcome our special guest to the Preaching the Globe segment, Pastor Anthony Preston from Lighthouse Ministries.
We greet you, my brothers and my sisters, in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. We are grateful for this opportunity to be with you right now. We are grateful for the invitation from my friend and brother, Pastor Christopher D. Williams, and the Globe Church family. Won't be before you long. There is a word from the Lord. If you will draw your attention with me to a very familiar passage of scripture, that is the book of Romans, chapter 8, verse 28. I want to lift for your hearing one verse and one verse only. Romans chapter 8, verse 28. This reading is from the New King James Version, and it simply reads, "And we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are the called according to his purpose." I want to simply talk to you for the few moments we're together from the subject, "It's in the Mix." One of my fondest memories of visiting my maternal grandparents in rural South Central Virginia is of my grandmother baking cakes. Other than from the spiritual aspect of my grandmother being known as a virtual woman, a family woman, a pillar of the community, she was also known as the Avon lady and the cake lady. And one of my fondest memories of visiting Big Ma in the summertime as a young child was her baking those cakes. If you name the cake, she baked it. And I remember the end result of my grandmother baking those cakes. Whether it was the coconut cake, whether it was the German chocolate cake, or whether it was simply an old-fashioned pound cake. I remember all of the cakes, the end result. And I used to be a skinny little boy. And I still had a sweet tooth. And I loved my grandmother's cakes. And whether she was baking a cake for the family to keep at the house, or whether someone in the community had placed an order, whenever she was getting those cakes together, she always made, especially if the batter was too much, she always had a small pan where she made a small cake. One day curiosity got the best of me, and because she would oftentimes, before she would finish baking the cake and we could slice it up, oftentimes my grandmother had an old hand mixer, and oftentimes when she got finished with the batter, she would pull the beaters out, and she would pass one to me and pass the other to my younger brother. Sometimes my younger brother would be outside playing, so I would get 2 beaters. Sometimes it was me outside playing, so he would get 2 beaters. Sometimes if we were both playing, she just simply watched the beaters. But I remember this one particular time, she let me lick I would do my finger like this and get inside those blades on that beater. And one particular time, before she got to finish the batter, curiosity got the best of me. Now, depending on what the cake was, the ingredients may vary down the line, but all of the cakes had the same basic starting ingredients, if you will. My grandmother always used eggs. My grandmother always used sugar. My grandmother always used flour. My grandmother always used, for rising purposes, baking powder and a few other things. My grandmother would always use butter. Now, depending on whether it was going to be a chocolate cake or a pound cake or a lemon cake or a coconut cake, as you moved on down into the process, the ingredients may start to vary, but to start the cake, it was always the eggs, the butter, the baking powder, the sugar, the eggs, if you will. And one time, curiosity got the best of me, and I noticed my grandmother had the eggs sitting on the counter off by themselves. And when my grandmother wasn't looking, I stuck my finger and tasted the eggs. Then when she was not looking again, I tasted the butter. Just the eggs by itself. I'm here to tell you, in case you don't know, that raw eggs by itself is not good. As creamy as the butter was, as much as I love butter on toast, butter by itself, it wasn't good. The baking powder by itself not only wasn't good, but was bitter. The eggs by themselves, the baking powder by themselves, the butter by themselves, the sugar was sweet to my palate. The sugar was sweet to my mouth. But even sugar by itself was bad. And so I began to wonder as a little kid, what was the magic that my grandmother was making? What was this magic she was creating? How is it? I've tasted the cakes before. I've even licked the beaters with the batter before the cake mix went into the oven, and even the batter was good. So how is it that all this stuff that makes up the cake, that makes up the good batter, how is it I've just snuck a taste of the eggs, of the baking powder, of the butter, of the sugar, of the flour? How is it that none of that tasted good? And we are going through life. I don't care how long you've been saved. Don't care how much you love God. Don't care what your title is. All of us have gone through life so much or enough that life's circumstances sometimes don't seem good. If it's not headache, it's heartache. If it's not one thing, it's another. If it's not you being tested in your relationships, you're tested in your health. If you're not tested in your health, you're tested in your finances. If you're not being tested by your health, your relationships, or your finances, the kids aren't acting right. And even those times when it's going well for you on the job, the devil will show up at church. And so it is. We have events that nothing seems to be going right. One day you're on top of the world, and you fool around and wake up the next day and find the world on top of you. But Paul gives us encouragement today. And in fact, if you look just 10 verses before the verse I read tonight, Romans 8:28, if you back up to Romans 8:18, it says that the suffering of this present time is not worthy to be compared to the glory that shall be revealed in us. We're going to have to suffer. We're going to have some good days and some bad days. I can remember here in Metro Atlanta that they were telling us on Friday to enjoy the nice weather on Saturday. Because if you did get a chance to get out and enjoy the sunshine on Saturday, that all this week, and today is evident, all this week the storms are going to come. It might not storm all day. It might only storm in the morning, might only storm at night, might storm midday. But we had to enjoy. They gave advance notice to enjoy it while it lasts, because the days coming after are going to be filled with storms. And sometimes it's the other way around. If we can just push through the storm, then the rest of the days are sunshine. How is it that my grandmother worked magic with eggs that didn't taste good, flour that didn't taste good, baking powder that didn't taste good, sugar that was sweet but didn't taste good, butter that was creamy but didn't taste good? My grandmother would let everything get room temperature, and she would start mixing stuff together. And as she mixed it together, then I began to see how she would working it all together. And sometimes with that hand mixer, she'd have to mix it so long that she had to switch hands because one hand would get tired. And as she's stirring up the mix, sometimes the mixer would splatter stuff up on those side walls of the bowl. And sometimes she had to turn the mixer off and get an old wooden spoon and tuck that bowl up under her arm and stir it and work out the lumps and smooth it out by hand. And there are times when stuff seems to rise up against us and it feels like we need to have to figure out a way to work out the lumps and work out the clumps in the mixture of this thing we call life. And so it is. Finally, I see how she does it. It wasn't that the eggs were supposed to be good by themselves, but we needed everything coming together for that cake mix to be sweet. Now, as sweet as the batter was, as much as I enjoyed licking the beaters and the spoon, that wasn't a finished product. Grandma had put the oven on 400 when she first pulled the ingredients out. So the oven was already hot. And there's some situations in lives that we walk into with our good godly selves, and we already walk into a situation that's already hot. Who am I talking to on today? And after she put the batter, the mixture in the oven, we were told we couldn't come through the kitchen walking hard or the cake would fall. But as the heat was able to start to affect the batter, then the whole kitchen began to take on the aroma of this cake. And after a certain amount of time, she would stick a toothpick in the cake to make sure it was done. She would take the cake out. She'd turn the cake pan upside down and she let it cool. And after the time that only she knew, she'd work that pan off of the cake. And she'd start stacking layers. And depending on what kind of cake it was, she'd start with her icing or her frosting, if you will. And she would take her time and align those cake slices, or those cake layers, if you will, so that the cake wasn't leaning one way or another. And she would take her time as if Michelangelo was painting a masterpiece and cover that cake with that frosting. And depending on what kind of cake it was, sometimes it was a lemon pound cake. And she wouldn't use frosting, but she would use a glaze. And so you're asking, what does this have to do with my life and your grandmama baking cakes? I'm glad you asked. My grandmama used butter. God uses brokenness. My grandmama used sugar. God will use sadness. My grandmama used baking powder, and God will use broken promises. My grandmama used broken eggs, and God will use enemies instead of the eggs. My grandmama used flour. God will use failures. Flour by itself isn't good, and failure by itself isn't good. Eggs by itself isn't good. Enemies by themselves aren't good. Butter by itself isn't good. Neither is brokenness by itself. But when you take the brokenness, when you take the bitterness, when you take the broken promises, when you take the sadness instead of the sugar, when you take the enemies instead of the eggs, and allow God to throw it in the bowl we call life. Sometimes God has a way of mixing it fast. And sometimes God will allow things to unfold slowly. But he mixes it. He allows it to make up who we are and what we are. And God, in his own timing, will work out the lumps. Sometimes you feel like life is beating you with a giant wooden spoon. That's just God working out the lumps in the mixture of your life. And so it is. Just like grandma had to preheat that oven for the oven to be hot, we will honestly find ourselves into some situations that straight up feel like hell. So some days you before your feet can hit the floor out the bed, you feel like hell is just breaking you loose in your life. But that's nothing but God heating up the oven. And just like, even though you're going through hard times and hot times and just straight up feel like you're going through hell, in that time, my grandmama would poke and prod that cake batter and pull out if she stuck that toothpick in and batter came up on the toothpick, she knew the cake wasn't done. And sometimes you feel like, if you're anything like me, let me not talk about you. Sometimes I feel like life is poking and prodding at me. Sometimes I feel like I'm being stuck here and stuck there. Sometimes they telling lies and they digging ditches and they setting traps, and they telling lies and they digging ditches and setting traps. Sometimes you work to make a good name and a reputation for yourself, and here comes life poking and prodding at you. Sometimes you dotted all the I's and crossed all the T's and still don't get the job, still don't get the contract, still don't get the church, still don't get the credit, because life is poking and prodding at you. But at that moment when only God knows, he snatches you out. Oh, you're too early to shout, because you want to shout because he's pulled you out of the hell. But the first thing my grandmama did when she pulled that cake out of the oven was flipped it upside down. And so it seems like we're going from pillar to post. Seems like the old saying is, if it ain't one thing, it's another. So we're out of hell, but now we feel like life is topsy-turvy. Sometimes you feel like you're on top of the world. Sometimes you feel like the world is on top of you because you've been flipped upside down. And God will allow people to walk away from you. And I'm not talking about strangers. I'm talking about families and friends. I'm talking about frat brothers and sorority sisters. I'm talking about church members. They will walk away from you because God has to let you cool down. But here comes the good part. I told you my grandmama covered that lemon pound cake with a glaze, right? Well, this is the part where God is going to cover you with his grace. I told you that my grandmother would take that yellow cake or that chocolate cake and begin to cover it with frosting. That's when God begins to cover you. If it ain't grace, he'll start covering you with favor. Now, how many of you know once that cake gets that glaze on it, you know it's about to be something good, don't you? You know once grandma got finished putting that frosting. And what I love about her putting that glaze on, what I love about her spreading that frosting is that she never missed a spot. So you've got broken promises, you've got bitterness, you've got sadness, you've got failure, you've got enemies. You've been put through hell. You've been snatched out of hell. You've been flipped upside down. You've been covered with grace. Covered from head to toe with favor. That even your enemies will have to say, now that was God. Brothers and sisters, as I get ready to leave you, all things won't be good, but all things will work together for the good. All things won't be good. Most of you listening to me tonight have already lived long enough to know all things won't be good, but all things will work together for the good. Remember, stay encouraged. Wherever you are at this point, whether you're just now spreading the ingredients or whether you've already come out the oven and been turned upside down, remember this, it's in the mix. God bless you.